O mais interessante vai ser o do Fred, mano. Esse do Fred aqui vai ser legal. Bora ver esse aqui do Fred. Esse Fred aqui vai ser legal. How Freddy became the weakest killer in DBD. Como o Fred se tornou o pior killer no DBD? É isso? Vamos dar um review aqui, né? Treinando os inglês da vida. É isso aí, o mais fraco. Então é isso. Como o Fred se tornou o killer mais fraco no DBD. Esse vídeo é de um ano atrás. Canal Ardefa, né? Ardefa, penso eu. E bora assistir então, né? O áudio tem que botar também, né? Nossa, aqui vamos ver. Vou ligar a legenda pra galera aqui também, né? Acho que é interessante. Bora lá.
If you're somewhat new to Dead by Daylight, chances are you don't know that Freddy was once the weakest killer in the game, and it wasn't even close. I'm not talking Legion or Myers bad, I'm talking no Mither bad, with Freddy's ability giving him a massive downside and no worthwhile strengths to make up for it. Original Freddy was nothing like the Freddy you're used to today. No blood snares to slow survivors down, no fake pallets, no gen teleport. His ability was waiting 7 seconds to be allowed to basic attack. He was the weakest killer by a landslide, and only 2 weeks after release, they annihilated him with a huge barrage of nerfs. Freddy's release, alongside Behavior's treatment of him, was a huge ordeal. It birthed countless.
Ai, meu Deus do céu, eu não consegui traduzir tudo aqui não. Quando você tem mais da metade, fica mais da metade do ano e você vê um pequeno buff ou rework e constantemente é o killer mais fraco do jogo. Acho que é isso, né? Metade do ano sem ver um pequeno buff ou rework continua sendo o killer mais fraco do jogo. Mas vocês é muito inglesudo, cara. Puta merda, velho. O FDL foi uma grande provação que deu origem a incontáveis
memes like Darn or Sharp Hand Joe caused huge backlash such as review bombs on Steam and even a killer exodus, and it's a huge stain on Behavior's reputation and is one of the biggest reasons that even to this day, Behavior is known for having a horrendous balance team. Let me take you back to a time when Freddy couldn't even attack survivors if they were awake. All the way back on the 26th of October 2017, Freddy Krueger released alongside Quentin Smith with the Nightmare on Elm Street chapter. Although the community was excited to get another licensed killer as famous as Myers, straight out the gate the chapter was already memed. Quentin's model was absolutely horrendous, featuring the ugliest face known to mankind alongside his teachable perks of Wake Up, Pharmacy, and Vigil. While Pharmacy and Vigil did find niche uses, Wake Up was memed instantly, as it granted a measly 15% faster gate opening speed compared to its modern day version of 25%. While Quentin didn't have much to offer for survivors, Freddy on the other hand came with some great additions to the killer roster, with Remember Me, a perk which made the gates take longer to open depending on how many times the killer hit the obsession, Blood Warden, which blocks survivors from escaping for 30 seconds if a survivor is hooked while the doors are open, and Fire Up, which insta-wins any game as soon as the killer loads in. Immediately, killer players gravitated towards Remember Me and Blood Warden in an attempt to create a slowdown build that didn't rely on the RNG-laden ruin. While Freddy didn't have anything in his actual kit that helped with late game pressure, unlike the Pig's Bear Traps, people still associated Freddy with being a late game killer due to his perks. It didn't take too long for players to give up on Remember Me. Although it certainly was nice when it worked, it was still a pretty big gamble, as the perk simply wouldn't work if the obsession was the one opening the doors, and you couldn't guarantee that the obsession would be dead, as back then...
É porque se a obsessão interage com o portão, nesse Remember Me, o Remember Me, quando você bate 4 vezes na obsessão, você vai ganhar a stack máxima, né? Então cada stack ali dura 12 segundos a mais para poder abrir o portão, totalizando 1 minuto a mais de tempo para poder abrir o portão. Se a obsessão interagir com a alavanca do portão, ela abre o portão normalmente, com a velocidade normal. Isso é foda. Sem skin, sem buff.
If somebody was the obsession, chances are they had Decisive Strike, which was still mega powerful. So, if anything, the obsession was more likely to be alive than anyone else. Blood Warden stuck around for significantly longer and actually still sees some degree of use today, but unfortunately the community overvalues it, with the perk never getting activated most of the time since survivors tend to just leave when the doors are open. Keep in mind, Blood Warden only activates if a survivor is hooked after the doors are open, not after they're powered. And then there was Freddy himself. He released with a completely different kit to the one you're used to today. As Survivor, it was actually a really immersive experience playing against Freddy, because when you were awake, you couldn't see him at all, even if he was 2 steps
Mas que travada chata da porra,
in
velho.
front of you. All you got was his constant lullaby alongside watching the grass move as he walked around, trying to
Olha essas travadas, mano.
find his next victim. The experience for Killer, however, was much less appealing.
Não me lembro, então acho que
When loading
sim.
into a match as Freddy, you were greeted with horrendously poor vision due to being in the
FPS,
dream world, and your only ability was putting survivors to sleep. That's it. No special attack, no
Cara,
way
fazer
to
live no
slow
TikTok tá
survivors,
fodendo demais meu
no
PC, velho.
fake pallets, just sleep. When holding your ability out, you could put one survivor to sleep at a
Cara,
time
isso era
from
muito
a
louco,
close
ó.
range. When attempting to
Esse
attack a
poder do
survivor,
Freddy.
nothing. That's right.
Olha lá,
Freddy
o dano não
simply
pega.
couldn't attack survivors who were
Você não pode
awake.
atacar enquanto você não botar ele no
You
seu
pull your
mundo.
ability out and mark a
No
survivor.
mundo dos sonhos.
Once Freddy has initiated a survivor's transition into the dream world, Freddy would be slowed drastically, similar to the nurse's walking speed, for 1 second. And after 7 entire seconds, the survivor would finally be asleep. No movement speed reduction, no blindness, no downsides whatsoever. Just 7 seconds of straight God mode for survivors.
Bizarro.
Now that's done, did Freddy get an alternate ability to use on sleeping survivors? No. After waiting 7 seconds, he finally earned the ability to basic attack a survivor, and that is as far as his active ability goes. There were no special attributes to this basic attack, no extra lunge range, nothing fancy, it was just a standard basic attack.
Ah, desligou as legendas, pô,
However,
esqueci.
sleeping survivors would be affected with debuffs. Healing, gen repairing, and totem cleansing speeds would be slowed by an almighty 50%. Additionally, any asleep survivors who are outside of Freddy's 16-meter terror radius for more than 1 second would have their aura permanently revealed to Freddy until either entering the terror radius again or waking up. They also couldn't see Freddy outside of that terror radius. As you can imagine, being permanently visible outside of a tiny terror radius ended up being quite frustrating for survivors who, back then, actually tried to break chase after a few loops, instead of happily rinsing every pallet in the map, as it effectively removed a strategy that survivors used to enjoy, even if Freddy himself wasn't that much of a threat due to having no actual ability. If somehow you actually broke chase, perhaps you were grouped up and he slept both of you and then chased the other person, if you went to go and repair a gen, heal, or do literally anything that survivors need to do to win, you would waste a ridiculous amount of time. For instance, gens would take 160 seconds to repair while asleep instead of the usual 80. As we all know, watching bars fill up over and over again really isn't fun, and having to watch bars fill up for twice as long was not a welcome mechanic. However, all of these downsides could be cleansed, and your invulnerability could be restored by simply finding a teammate to wake you up or failing any skill check, gens, healing, or even self-caring. Missing one skill check was all survivors had to do in order to completely nullify Freddy's entire kit. And if multiple people were on a gen, only one person needed to miss a skill check and everyone would wake up. In those days, self-care was super popular. It hadn't been gutted like it is nowadays, and due to overall player skill being lower, it was used much more frequently. You'd be seeing multiple almost every single game. So, using self-care, survivors could effectively delete Freddy's power from the game. What would happen was, Freddy would find someone and put them to sleep, then they would have 7 seconds of God mode to run to a loop. Keep in mind there were tons more pallets in the game back then. Freddy would injure you, you'd drop the pallet, and while Freddy was in the pallet break animation, you'd run off to the next loop, and then start self-caring while spamming the skill check button to instantly fail a skill check as soon as it popped up.
Cai no mundo dos sonhos de novo. Ali ele falou ali, ó, ele mostrou um loop, né, que acontecia, né? O pessoal, ele fazia aquele poder, ele tinha uma coisa que ele usava assim, você canalizava o poder dele e ia fazendo um negócio até o cara entrar no mundo dos sonhos. Aí o cara ficava se rilando, fazendo alguma coisa daquele tipo e spamando skill check pra errar, que aí o cara acordava de novo. Era muito fraco, Fred.
Needless to say, Freddy was abysmal. People could unhook survivors right in your face as Freddy, and all you can do is stand there and watch as you waited for those 7 long seconds to pass before you could actually start interacting with the survivors. Killer players were let down, to say the least. They had just spent their money on a killer that can't kill.
Nice.
However, it wasn't the end of the world, since Freddy wasn't just a little bit
Eu não sei se é por causa desses 60 FPS, mano. Não sei se é a legenda.
weak and was instead absolutely horrendous beyond all belief. Clearly the worst killer in the game by a landslide. There's no way the devs would ignore him.
Cara, a legenda.
Things needed to.
Como é que vai ser a legenda? Azedou. Esse cara fala pra caraca, eu não vou conseguir traduzir tudo. Eu também, quando eu falar, não vou entender. Tem hora que eu nem entendo o normal.
To change. So, 2 weeks after his release on the 9th of November 2017, patch 1.8.1 released, bringing a whole host of new changes to Freddy. So, what did behavior have in store for the weakest killer in Dead by Daylight history? Nerf. Sleeping survivors' auras would only be revealed to Freddy 10 seconds after leaving his terror radius, 10 times slower than before. Nerf. His terror radius when survivors were asleep was increased from 16 meters to 24 meters.
Aqui ele tá falando dos nerfing,
by
né?
daylight history. Nerf. Sleeping survivors' auras would only be revealed to Freddy 10 seconds after leaving his terror radius. 10
Rapaz, eu escutei tudo que ele falou, mas quem disse que eu consigo traduzir? Moça, é muito rápido, velho. Mas o sobrevivente adormecido de nerf. Nossa, velho, aqui tá difícil, tá? Pra traduzir essa parada aqui, velho. Autogerada, deve pesar, é isso mesmo. Sobrevivente adormecido, só seriam revelados a Freddy. 10 segundos depois de deixar ser de terror.
Nerf.
This is my radius when survivors were asleep was increased from 16 meters. Estava dormindo, foi aumentado de 16 metros a 24 metros.
An increase of 50%. Nerf. After initiating a survivor's transition to the dream state, Freddy's movement speed would be slowed for 3 seconds instead of the previous 1 second, 3 times longer than before. Nerf. Survivors are instantly woken up the moment they're downed. The killer community went from feeling a little bit let down to pure, utter outrage. In a time where killers as a whole were already horrible to play due to Decisive Strike still being in its prime, gens were faster, there were way more pallets in the game, insta-heals were still in the game, insta-blinds were still in the game, maps were bigger, and infinite loops were still running rampant in loads of maps, Behavior had not only released the weakest killer ever, but then proceeded to slam him with a series of huge nerfs a mere 2 weeks after his release. The killer community was not going to let that slide. At that point in time, killers were already playthings for survivors, and killers were in dire need of buffs for ages, and this was the straw that broke the camel's back for many players. The players were done with asking nicely for the devs to actually do their job, and instead took matters into their own hands. A killer exodus. Many killer players simply stopped playing killer. Some switched to survivor, while others just stopped playing Dead by Daylight entirely during that period. After all, if the devs only cared about survivor players, then they'd have to react, since survivors wouldn't be able to play the game at all if there were no killers. While survivor queues certainly took longer than usual, it ultimately amounted to nothing. Why would the devs nerf such a weak character? Especially when killers like Billy and Nurse were leaving.
Cara, os devs nessa época já cagavam pro jogo, né, velho? Pra variar, né? Não dá diferença nenhuma de hoje em dia, né? É a mesma bosta. É engraçado, né? Como é que as coisas é monótona, né? Mesmo jeito, cara, mesma coisa.
It didn't make any sense. Well, one look at Dead by Daylight's Steam page revealed all. A review bomb. A huge onslaught of negative reviews all submitted at the same time. And what did the reviews say? The new killer Freddy Krueger was far too overpowered and made the game absolutely horrible for survivors. What? Were these people playing a different game? This made absolutely no sense.
Não fazia sentido
what was going on? The problem was a lack of information. In those days, a ridiculously huge portion of the community was made up of very casual players. Players who would simply load up.
Os posts foram feitos por sobreviventes muito casuais, né? Pelo que ele tá falando aqui.
The game every now and then and queue. They didn't keep up with patch notes, new metas, or even read killer descriptions. They just wanted to load up the game and play it. Due to this lack
of... pessoal que só tá abrindo o jogo, carregando e jogando, não tá procurando saber como é que funciona isso, aquilo, pelo que ele tá falando aqui.
Reading or researching, these lower tier players had no idea about the incredibly easy counter to Freddy of simply failing a skill check.
Tá falando que não faz de tanto que é fácil, né? Counterar e jogar contra o Freddy, né? Aparentemente. É igualzinho o pessoal, quando a gente chega com um killer novo, surge um novo, o pessoal no chat começa a falar trem. Ah, que o boneco tal tá forte demais. O tanto que, mano, tanto de gente que vê no meu chat por falar que o Vecna tava forte. Meu Deus do céu. Eu só concordava, cara, porque eu não vou começar a discutir um trem desse no chat, não. Entendeu? Mano, é coisa desse mesmo jeito que ele fala. Às vezes a pessoa casual quer dar pitaco no bagulho, tá ligado? Aí eu vou lá, pego o trem e diz que ainda sou casual, né? Pego de killer lá, jogo tal, aprendo o bonequinho, brinco, beleza. Dou um ataque no surf, depois de um prazo, e o surf ainda tá aprendendo, né? E depois eu pego o surf quando vê, dou um ataque no killer. É loucura, mano.
Would instead either spend ages running around trying to find a teammate to manually wake them up, thus losing tons of pressure while the killer killed people, or they would give up and attempt to work through gens while asleep at that massive 50% debuff, which would of course seem absolutely nuts. One piece of information was the line between Freddy being a crazy slowdown killer or being practically unplayable, and that information was what the casual players lacked. Don't get me wrong, no hate to people for playing a game casually, there's nothing wrong with that at all. But there is something wrong with instantly review bombing the game to force the devs to nerf an already trashed character purely because you can't be bothered to learn the 2-button combination that instantly counters him. That is absolutely insane. But that wasn't the only factor though. Even amongst higher tier survivors, Freddy wasn't exactly popular. Even though they had no problems with countering him, a lot of players found playing against Freddy to be tedious, frustrating, and boring.
O pessoal nem liga jogar contra o Freddy, né?
Since Freddy had no actual ability, playing against a Freddy ended up being quite boring, as there was literally nothing he could do other than walk at you. And since Freddy players would rarely ever break Chase due to his ability to see survivor auras, chases against him provided very little stimulation to good survivors. Whenever you were not in a chase, the requirement to wake yourself up after every encounter with him was simply monotonous, and it was made worse if you didn't use self-care, since you'd have to run all the way over to a gen in order to wake up, delaying the process even more.
É, que ele tá falando que no caso é fácil, né, de ficar tirando. Não sei se a palavra seria fácil, né, mas que todo mundo fica quebrando isso, né, o poder dele de uma forma muito tranquila. É, se curando e errando skill check, erra um skill check no gerador, já reseta tudo, então é foda. Ele é muito sensível, né?
Even less interactive for survivors in a chase. While Freddy was absolutely garbage beyond all belief, there was a positive side to his position. The memes. Darn or Sharp Hand Joe were two quotes that you could drop at any moment and people would instantly understand that you were making fun of Freddy's abysmal state. I often get people in my comments bragging about how they reached rank 1 without Ruin or without some other meta perk. Well, back in my day, we played perkless Sharp Hand Joe for our memes. No perks at all, no add-ons, just little Sharp Hand Joe and his 7-second survivor god mode grinding up to the top of the ranks. Sure, it was torturous, but my god was it funny. When you inevitably got annihilated by a full insta-blind sprint burst decisive strike leader and borrowed time stomp squad, there was no rage, no hatred, no emotion at all. All you said was darn.
Cara, é muito besta, né, velho, aquilo que tá falando aqui. Foda que eu não consigo entender tudo, né, cara? Eu meio que tô... Horas aqui eu tô assistindo, horas eu tô tentando entender um pouco pra falar aqui pro chat aqui pra galera. É complicado, mano.
Freddy remained in this embarrassing state until July of 2019 when he finally got his rework, turning him into the killer you're all familiar with today. When he first got his rework, the community immediately deemed him as strong. Not overpowered, but definitely not garbage anymore, with snares being the favoured ability for him. As time went on, the community learned to deal with him better, and he has since fallen out of favour, but still being much better than some other killers, and certainly way better than he used to be. Recently, I've seen a lot of players leaning more towards fake pallets instead of the snares, but time will tell if that remains the favoured ability or if players go back to snares. This now leaves us with one question. What do you think is better, snares or fake pallets?
Só tá falando, né, que o pessoal tá preferindo jogar de pallet. Eu particularmente gosto mais de jogar de pallet fake do que de poça, cara. Agora tá perguntando, hein, qual que é o mais eficiente, que é o top que ele tá pensando.
Has their upsides and downsides, but I personally lean towards the snares just because you don't have to rely on preset pallet spawns. Additionally,
ele acha que ele prefere as poças, né, que coloca nos spawn de preset ali dos pallets ali, fica melhor, né?
I recently played a match with the fake pallets and there were only 3 places on the entire map I could place the fake pallets, meaning that every single possible...
Caraca, ele jogou onde Freddy só tinha 3 lugares pra botar pallet fake.
Pallet spawn, -3. Spawned. So yeah, I think I'll go with snares for now. I hope you enjoyed the video and thank you so much for sticking to the end. If you have any other things you'd like me to discuss in a similar style to this video, be sure to let me know. You can catch me live on twitch.tv/arditha.
Nossa, velho, na moral. Cara, muito zoado, né, velho? Que o Fredola sofre, mano. Você tá doido. É muita sofrência pra um cabo só. Sofrência até falar chega, mano. Sério, esmilhado pelo meta não havia ódio, rancor ou raiva, não havia sentimentos apenas. Darn. O que seria esse Darn? Ai, velho, na moral, mano. Que bagulho besta, velho. É muito foda, tá? Realmente, cara, o Fred, ele... Cara, ele mudou demais, né, velho? Quando ele ficou bacana... Ah, tá. Manjei, então. É que ele começou a ficar insano, velho. Os caras cortou a brincadeira, velho. Podou o bicho. Aí foi foda. Foi triste, foi sério. Darn. Muito bom, velho, muito bom. Mais uma vez, quem quiser comenta aí, deixa o like, se inscreve, que ajuda demais da conta. Eu agradeço demais quem assistiu até o final aí. E é isso, velho.